to put aside my own anger and sadness during this time. And really be able to articulate what our communities need to hear, because the reality is, what can you say? I've watched the body cam video. I watched it for 30 minutes. I watched the interaction with Mr. Brooks, and it broke my heart when he talked about his daughter's birthday party that he was planning for. This is not confrontational. This was a guy that you were rooting for. And even knowing the end, watching it, you're going, just let him go. Just let him go. Let him call somebody to pick him up. And I think that's the challenge that we're all facing as leaders right now. People are looking to us to lead. But when these things continue to happen over and over again, we're asking ourselves the same questions. How do we lead during this time? We had just convened an advisory committee awaiting recommendations in 2 weeks on how we look at our use of force policies. And not even 3 days into this advisory committee before I can even get a report, we have a deadly shooting in Atlanta. And the only thing that I can call upon right now are the things that we have called upon historically. And that's just this reminder that we will get to the other side of this. But in the meantime, we got to keep pushing. And it's I know it doesn't matter to the families because their loved ones are gone. But just for them to understand that these deaths will not be in vain. There's a movement across this country, and it is changing all of our cities.
Protests grew in Atlanta last night over a deadly police shooting. A new name being chanted. Rayshard Brooks, fatally shot by police at a fast food drive-thru in Atlanta. Protesters shut down an entire interstate and set fires at and near the Wendy's restaurant where Brooks was killed Friday night. Earlier, police used tear gas and a flashbang to try to clear the area. The Georgia Bureau of Investigation says police were called around 10:30 p.m. Friday night about a man sleeping in a car in a Wendy's drive-thru. Police say that man, Brooks, failed a field sobriety test and then resisted arrest. In video taken by a bystander, you can see a struggle. According to the GBI, the yellow object in the officer's hand is a taser. Eventually, Brooks appears to swing at an officer before taking off with the taser. Wendy's surveillance video, released by the GBI, picks up where that video ends. What you see is Brooks running from the police. At one point, he appears to turn back towards the officer and discharge the taser before turning back around and continuing to run. You then see him fall to the ground. Here's the moment Brooks appears to discharge the taser and the officer fires. Here it is once more in slow motion. Brooks was shot, taken to the hospital where he died, the GBI said. Attorneys representing Brooks' family spoke out last night.
Why not talk to him as a human being and say, hey, buddy, maybe you had too much to drink. Leave your car here. Take Uber. I've seen it happen before. But that didn't happen. Instead, they got physical. He ran. He did have the taser. But according to law, a taser is not a lethal weapon. So he didn't have a lethal weapon in his hand. He was running with the taser, and then they shot him. It's just, it didn't need to happen.
Garrett Rolfe, the police officer who shot and killed Brooks, has been terminated, Atlanta police spokesman Carlos Campos tells CNN. The second police officer, Devin Brosnan, has been placed on administrative duty. And the police chief is stepping down.
We need to change the culture of policing. We need to evaluate how we train police. We need to make sure police not only support the communities that they have a duty to protect and serve, but in many cases they need to be in the community that they have a duty to protect and serve.
A cousin of Brooks spoke yesterday.
I didn't think he was going to hit right here, man. I thought this city was better than that. they got to answer. Somebody need to say something. Somebody need to at least let the family know something. We need to at least know that the city is with us.
Now, the death of Rayshard Brooks, think about this. It's just come during weeks of demonstrations across the country over the deaths of Ahmaud Arbery, Breonna Taylor, George Floyd.
Paulo Sandoval has been covering the protests. Paulo, good morning to you.
Hey guys, good morning. As we wait for that video to be released, let me take you across the country and just give you a snapshot of what we've seen the last 24 hours in terms of that call for reform, that call for change in New Orleans, making a very strong statement here in this case as they took to a local park there in New Orleans and eventually ended up throwing a statue of a mid-19th century slave owner into the Mississippi River. Authorities saying the protesters damaged the monument to John McDonough during the afternoon and then loaded up onto a truck, drove it to the banks of the river and then threw it in. New Orleans police saying that they have apprehended the drivers of that truck, but not commenting further. I also want to take you to Washington, D.C. and New York. Very similar scenes playing out in both those major cities. In the nation's capital, protests making its way from Lafayette Park, which was the scene of some very tense situation a couple of weeks ago. But yesterday, really quite peaceful as these demonstrators making a symbolic move to take a knee, showing their solidarity with the family of George Floyd. Also a very similar scene that took place in Brooklyn at Barclays Center as well. And then finally in Washington, that demonstration did continue through the weekend here with that in Seattle, where demonstrators have been refusing to leave the city's Capitol Hill neighborhood. The occupation prompting the police department to even close down or board up a local police department or local police precinct. But authorities there are saying that they do hope to eventually reopen and resume operations. So what do all of these have in common, Victor and Christy? That call for change, that call for reform. Yesterday, the governor here in New York saying he will be giving municipalities in New York State until the 1st of April of 2021 to not only reassess, but also institute these changes that so many people are calling for this morning.
I do not believe that this was a justified use of deadly force and have for the immediate termination of the officer. What has become abundantly clear over the last couple of weeks in Atlanta is that while we have a police force full of men and women who work alongside our communities with honor, respect, and dignity, there has been a disconnect with what our expectations are and should be as it relates to interactions with our officers and the communities in which they are entrusted to protect. Chief Erica Shields has been a solid member of APD for over 2 decades and has a deep and abiding love for the people of Atlanta. And because of her desire that Atlanta be a model of what meaningful reform should look like across this country, Chief Shields has offered to immediately step aside as police chief so that the city may move forward with urgency in rebuilding the trust so desperately needed throughout our communities. Former Assistant Police Chief and now Interim Corrections Chief Rodney Bryant will serve as the Interim Police Chief as we immediately launch a national search for new leadership. Chief Shields will continue in a role to be determined. To the men and women of APD, your service and sacrifice on behalf of our communities is not lost upon me, and I remain grateful for the work that you do to keep our city safe. But as Dr. King reminded us many years ago, there is a fierce urgency of now that calls upon each of us, myself included, to be held accountable to the communities in which we are entrusted to serve. For that reason, we have already convened an advisory committee to examine our use of force policies in our city and expect feedback within the next 2 weeks with final recommendations within the next 45 days.
Very awful situation has unfolded in Atlanta. You're looking at live pictures coming in from that Wendy's over there where the incident occurred last night. Look at that building. It's now totally engulfed in flames. That's where Rayshard Brooks, he was in his car, simply going through the drive-thru. He fell asleep. Our cars were going around him. The police showed up, and then that situation deteriorated big time, resulting in Rayshard Brooks, 27 years old, being shot and killed by police. And there are a lot of angry folks in Atlanta. They blocked off Interstate 75, a major interstate in the Atlanta area. Firefighters can't even get to the Wendy's and other places in the area to deal with that fire. So that fire continues right now with no firefighters on the scene. Ariva Martin is still with us, our legal analyst. She's a civil rights attorney at the same time. Ariva, as you see the situation, it was a very peaceful demonstration, but then things quickly deteriorated.
Yeah, we've seen that happen with really throughout the country as we've watched these protests erupt following the brutal murder of George Floyd. And I think we minimize the pain of the protesters when we only focus on the fires or the looting, because I don't think we can even understand the African American community, and communities really all over the world are feeling as we watch these deaths play out. When being killed by the police is the sixth leading cause of death for black men, we're way beyond policy changes. We're way beyond body cams or policies as it relates to tasers. We have to have that incredibly uncomfortable conversation in this country that focuses on systemic racism. And we get real close to having that conversation. We teeter around the edges of it, but then we retreat from it. But until we have that conversation, we can enact policies at the federal level. They're not going to be carried in any way that respects the dignity and humanity of African American men. And we keep seeing that over and over again. We have been at this on so many occasions. Walter Scott, as Chris Stewart talked about, Michael Brown, Tamir Rice, Trayvon Martin. We can do a roll call of all the African American men that have been killed by police and what happens in the aftermath. There's intense media scrutiny of the death. There's a protest. There's call for change. And then we go back. We retreat back to a place that's safe without pushing through and having this conversation about racism. It permeates around this country, and we have to have that conversation at this moment, or we'll be right back here. Not in 5 years, suggest we'll be back probably next week and definitely next month.
I'm meteorologist Tyler Malden for CNN. What do you say we take a look at your forecast for today and what's coming down the pike for next week? Starting out west across the Four Corners, where we have had an elevated fire the last couple of days. We continue to see that today and on into early next week. Roughly 5 million people in this part of the country under a warning or a southern Oregon, and northeast Nevada frost advisories. That makes sense. That's not supposed to happen. It's June. We're supposed to be feeling the heat. Oh, Phoenix is feeling some oppressive heat. We're 2 weeks into the month of June, and you have had a 105-degree weather days. In fact, out of the 13 days that we've seen thus far, you've had 9 days of temperatures of 105, and you know what? We're going to add to that next week. The Pacific Northwest, we have a rainmaker coming ashore. Could give us even some wintry precip late tonight in portions of Idaho, the higher elevations of Idaho, and a lot of rainfall for Seattle, Washington, down to Portland, Oregon, where you're already seeing a surplus of rainfall for this month. The southeast, flash flood threat. This stalled by an accompanying low pressure system that has given us some rainfall this weekend. We're going to add to that today and next week. Florida, you could pick up roughly 5 inches of rainfall. We saw some flooding in the southwest Florida region. Naples, you saw some flooding Saturday. That's possible again as we go into later on this afternoon and next week. But look at North Carolina and South Carolina. Holy cow, the oranges and the reds, that indicates about 6, 7, maybe even more than that inches of rain. Like, that's a lot of rain, guys. So do play safe. Remember, if you run across flooded area, turn around, don't drown. Big heat on the way. This is going to come from the southwest. It's going to push to the east. Atlanta, you have not seen a 90-degree day thus far this June. That's going to change by the time we get to the end of next week. I'm Ty, the weather guy for CNN.
Well, hi, Anna. We are in the heart of the occupation area, or the Capitol Hill Autonomous Zone, as protesters have called it. Let's show you what things look like. It has this sort of street festival vibe. You can see all these folks here on the street, and that is the police station that has effectively been taken over by the protesters. You can maybe see the graffiti there on the sign where it says the Seattle People Department, and this has been going on since Monday. As you know, you had violent clashes taking place in Seattle between some of the protesters and police. Tear gas was deployed. It was a really ugly situation. And the city made the calculated decision that they were going to try to de-escalate the situation, so they left, and that created a vacuum, and that vacuum was filled with protesters. The mayor seems to be in no hurry to want to get this situation to end. She is saying that this is an expression of democracy, and she's advanced no plans in terms of how or when this occupation might end. In the meantime, I want you to hear from one protester we spoke with who is responding to some of the fiery rhetoric from President Trump, and you're also going to hear from a police officer who has acknowledged that the department has made some mistakes. Take a look.
I'm not scared of Donald Trump, no, and I'm not scared of his police officers either. We're going to stay outside this building whether they come here or not. We're going to take this building over whether they're outside threatening us or not. We brought the fight them on their front lines and push their line back. We're not afraid of them.
We want a dialogue. We want to communicate, right? But it's how do we start that? How do we do better? People expect better. We need to be better.
Now, Anna, in terms of what these protesters want, there is a whole laundry list of demands, but among the primary things, this will sound familiar, they want to see the police department defunded, but they also want to see this police precinct turned into a community center. Now, one of the problems that has arisen as a result of protesters filling this area and the officers leaving that precinct is that, according to the chief of the department, it has increased the response time triple. So, in other words, what used to take 5 minutes to respond to a situation or a police call in this area is now taking 15 minutes. So that is worrisome, and that's why the chief wants to see this situation come to an end as quickly as possible. Anna?
Like presidents before him, President Trump delivered the commitment to this year's graduates of the West Point Military Academy. But a few other striking differences. Take a look. Each second lieutenant is celebrating their graduation at 6 feet apart due to the coronavirus pandemic. The president's speech coming at a time when the nation is undergoing racial unrest, a pandemic, and tensions between the White House and the U.S. military. CNN White House correspondent Jeremy Diamond attended today's ceremonies and is joining us now from West Point. So, Jeremy, the president spoke for almost 30 minutes today. How did he keep it relevant and current?
Well, it was a fairly staid address from the president. You know, he really did stick to the remarks that were in the teleprompter for him. We did hear the president, though, acknowledge, at least in passing, this notion of turbulent times that this country is currently going through. We heard the president thank the National Guard in particular, both for its role in handling the coronavirus pandemic, but also in terms of its role, as he has seen it, in terms of the unrest that we have seen in several cities in America and the deployment of some of those National Guardsmen. It was interesting, though, as we heard the president talk about the turbulent times, for him to fall back on the notion of the importance of institutions in this moment, particularly because what we have seen from the president in recent weeks is what many view as him politicizing the military. The president has come under withering criticism, both from some current military officials as well as those past military and defense officials, like the Secretary of Defense, Jim Mattis, who criticized the president for deploying National Guardsmen to handle the unrest in Lafayette Park just over a week ago. The president, though, insisting that institutions will stand the test of time. So a very interesting message from the president there, particularly in the face of some of the criticism that he has faced. Not, however, hear the president address in a more comprehensive manner than we have this national reckoning on racism that this country is facing. The president really avoid delving deeply to that issue, and that certainly his focus was on today during his remarks.
This is coming to us from Texas. At least 8 people have been shot here in an incident in San Antonio. This happened last night outside of 2 bars. This is what we know from police. A group was denied entry into one of the bars. A man then walked to his car, we're told, and then pulled out a rifle. Police also say that the man said that he was a UFC fighter from California, no name released, and we know that police are still looking for that shooter. They say, though, that there is no threat currently to that area.
I'm Ty, the weather guy for CNN. Over the last couple of days, heard us talk about that elevated fire risk across the Southwest. You're here to talk about that for the rest of this weekend and as we go into the beginning of next week, too. Now, we've had a lot of wildfires across the region. In Arizona, you specifically, you currently have 10 wildfires that aren't contained. Those are 10 active wildfires. One of those, the Bighorn Fire, right outside of Tucson, nearly 9,000 acres scorched and only 10% contained. We're going to see a critical fire risk for the regions shaded in red today and tomorrow. That's because we have the excessive heat, the strong winds, and yeah, those dry conditions too. So be smart if heading outside. Take a look at your screen real quick. I have some tips here for you. Some things that you want to avoid this weekend in that region, because these right here, these activities could easily cause a spark, which could cause a fire. And that's why we have a high fire risk for this region. Now, more than 6 million people are under a red flag warning right now, and roughly 1.5 million people are under a fire weather watch as well. One of those main ingredients causing this is the drought. And as you can see, we have a severe to extreme drought across much of the Southwest, the Great Basin, and going into the West Coast. Forecast radar shows some decent rainfalls up there towards the Pacific Northwest, but not much across the Southwest. Unfortunately, the Four Corners, you may pick up half an inch for the next 5 days, so that's not going to help anything. That's not going to help that drought, nor are these winds that we're going to see this weekend. We could see wind gusts all the way up to 50 miles per hour, if not a little stronger in some spots. In addition, we are going to see a bubble of heat come up through the southwest on into the plains, and that is some real big league heat next week. Tucson, your average, get this, 100 degrees. We'll be